Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in this Land Tenure and Pastoralist Societies Learning Alliance. Thanks everybody that has found the time to participate in this activity. It is already our last webinar during our last topic in this Learning Alliance. Let me first start introducing once again who is going to be presenting this webinar. First of all, here in Grade, in Lima, Peru, I am leading the presentation. As you already know, I am Manuel Glave. I am a Peruvian economist. Graduated in the University of Illinois in the USA, as well as in the Catholic University, and I am a senior researcher at Grade and a full professor at Catholic University. In Nairobi, in the Tegemeo Institute, our co-chair in this webinar is Dr. Tim Yeru. He also has a PhD in economics and a master's in international development from the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies in Japan, and currently he is a research fellow at the Tegemeo Institute in Nairobi. And together with me in Lima is Sandra Rodriguez. She is a bachelor's in anthropology from the Catholic University of Peru, and she has been working with me and with Gerardo Damonte for the last 4 or 5 years in different research projects on natural resources, extractive industries, and social conflicts. Please, as you may recall, for those of you that have already participated in the previous webinar, it is fairly easy to interact with ourselves, with a moderator, with me, or with other participants during this presentation. The two main features that you should be aware of are the language and the chat channel. If you prefer to have the webinar, if you prefer to listen to the webinar in Spanish, for example, at the bottom of the presentation, at the right hand corner in the bottom, you can see a phrasing, say your language. You can press there and change from English to Spanish or from Spanish to English. And in the chat channel that is immediately below the video, you can press and change the channel from the general channel or from the or to the questions channel in order for the moderators to have a direct link to the questions that you may be presenting during our presentation. Please feel free to write down your questions at any moment. Team and ourselves, we are going to handle your question as fast as we can. Of course, you can also contact directly to one person if you go to the participants in the audience bottom in the left-hand side. You have like a individual with different bubbles in the head that it has the audience. You can go there and send a message or have a chat to one specific participant, to have a private chat. Okay, let's start it. As you can see, it's fairly easy. It's a fantastic environment to have this exchange. So, what is the main objective of this webinar? We would like to lead our discussion during this 6th topic in the Learning Alliance to the main policy debate regarding land policies and the new directions in pastoralist development and governance of rangelands. As you can see, we have divided the presentation in three issues. What is the dominant land policy approach currently in our countries, both in East African countries as well as in the Andean countries, and how this dominant land policy is leading to new directions in pastoralist development in our regions. And at the end, we would like to come back to our framework, our analytical framework of governance of rangelands. So, but first of all, we are going to go through these issues of the dominant land policies and the new directions in pastoralist development. Having said that, and after this brief introduction, and with a question of which have been the dominant land policies oriented to pastoralist societies, I will give the room. I will give the voice to our friend Tim in Nairobi. So please, Tim.
As Manuel has explained, our Learning Alliance has been basically trying to understand the evolution of land tenure regimes in pastoralist societies, identifying drivers, currently with the aim of contributing to the current debate on land issues, especially the ones that touch on pastoralist societies. So I will just touch on briefly what has been the land policy approach from a historical perspective to get to where we are right now. As we have seen in our discussions, even in the Learning Alliance, there has been a lot of misconception about pastoralism, and land policies that have been implemented since the colonial period. In the case of East Africa, we find that these have been kind of shaped on the misconceptions that currently exist. So, for example, we know that we don't know very much detail what happened before the colonialists landed in the East African coastline. But we know that when the colonialists came, two things happened for pastoralist societies. One is that the land where they reside in was not prime. So it wasn't of great interest to them. So they first of all, kind of ignored them. And then later on, as early as the 1940s, we see a great push towards introducing private tenure within this, for these particular communities. And this was mainly driven by the misconception because the public policy regarded the land to be underutilized, because pastoralists would practice nomadic pastoralism, that is mobility. They would move from one place to the other in search of water and pasture. And so two things kind of shaped up. First of all was to try and introduce private tenure for these particular lands, rangelands. And then the second thing was to curtail the mobility, kind of try and convert pastoralists to sedentary livestock farmers. So just to kind of discuss these two important issues separately. So on land privatization, sorry, my slide is not moving forward. So on land privatization, we see that the first thing that happened on privatization was that the rationale or the logic to introduce privatization was to try and avoid the tragedy of commons. And basically this was because the public policy of the colonial government and successive African governments believed that the system was inefficient. It led to environmental degradation because each farmer or each pastoralist tried to keep as many animals as possible. So the idea was to introduce land privatization and kind of limit that mobility, and it was expected that this would lead to intensification geared towards increasing productivity. And what was expected was that farmers now would change their breeds, improve their breeds to more higher yielding breeds in terms of both milk and beef, and they would be able to be supported by provision of credit, for them to be able to get this breed and improve their management. Then the government also was to provide amenities, for example, water, which was a key resource in the production systems. So what we see is that what public policy was concerned with was rather the system, with the production rather than with the system, and trying to understand the nature and why pastoralists adapted this system. And over time, literature has shown that the imposition of this kind of rights system, to kind of ignoring a very complex socio-ecological system that has been generated by pastoralists and passed on from time to time, kind of failed. Then the other thing that we see also, we talked about, was sedentarization, and this was because public policy perceived this to be primitive. So the idea was to introduce controls and make sure that farmers are now not moving from place to place, and then it was expected that the state would be able to provide amenities like water, education, schooling, and so forth. But we know that, again, from a historical perspective and in literature, this did not happen as planned. So giving or citing the cases that we have in our reps, and in the case of Kenya and the East African Savannah. So for example, we know that in the Maasai lands, which were the first pastoralist community to have an interaction with the colonial government, the government tried this on two fronts. They tried to sedentarize the Maasai community. They also tried to introduce private tenure on the land that the Maasai used. So private tenure was already in conflict because the Maasai community believed that land was a birthright, universally accessible to everybody. So by restricting it or restricting ownership to different people, this of course was going against what they believed culturally. So what we find that even though the state tried to introduce this, they tried to continue using the land as they were doing before, like that is to use customary norms to continue using land even as land tenure was being privatized. The other thing that we saw was that as early as 1950s, the colonial government tried to introduce to kind of introduce grazing schemes, and this were geared towards making these communities sedentary so that they would stop moving from one place to the other. So I'm already seeing a question here. The trends towards sedentarization and privatization also present within tribal and communal lands. Yes, and this is not only a matter of public policy. So I was kind of explaining from my historical perspective, and this kind of were passed on, and we see that from successive generations of administrations, the public policy, of course, on one hand, continue to maintain this stand. Then on the other hand, we find that changes, for example, towards in terms of demography changes and urbanization, kind of now started to force changes amongst the systems that the communities were seeing. And I'll be showing this in the next slide, as explained, the consequences of these two key actions. So one, let me mention the first one is we continue to see that up to date. One of the other questions is that when I'm talking about privatization, especially in the Maasai community, one of the things that the colonial government tried to do was introduce group ranches. So group ranches is a form of private land tenure, and the way it operates is that a group, which can be a family, a clan, or a community, but is defined by membership. That is, it's a finite group. You can actually tell how many members are in that particular group, are registered. Land is registered under the ownership of a group instead of an individual. And then the government had passed a law that allowed the group to manage, this land as a group by having sure that the law provided for the election of management committee with rules and structures of how they were supposed to do that. The land sizes did vary from, I think we have some ranches that were almost like 6,000 hectares, and some were maybe a few hundred hectares. So the shift was that even though land was defined to a group, they continued to use land communally and using customary norms, and kind of ignored the laws that were supposed to be used to govern the group. So rather than use the laws that were passed when the groups were being formed, they continue to use the customary norms to manage these particular groups. So in up to where so I was trying to give a historical perspective of the dominant land policies to where we are right now in both the East African countries, both Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania. There has been a lot of debate about communal land, and currently in Kenya, the community land bill is being debated in parliament, and it's supposed to kind of give communities more voice in management and use of their land. So part of the reason for this is that we've seen that even though land privatization was advocated for as a guard against environmental degradation, this continued to happen because even as land became small because of demographics and as land tenure was also being introduced in communal lands, pastoralists never reduced their herds. So they kept maintaining large herds of cattle, and they tried to continue to actually up to date. Most communities are still mobile, and they move from one place to the other, in search of resources such as pasture and land. And then we see change in land use, especially where private land tenure was introduced, and the private land tenure was not consistent. So what we see is that where there was potential for change in land use, the land was converted to other uses. Other uses include provision for human settlement for land that was near urban areas, land that was arable was converted to for crop farming, and in other cases, for example, in western Uganda, we see that there are a lot of natural resource exploitation that is taking place there. Yeah, I am seeing a comment from Kevin Doyle that land privatization among pastoral community was the only mechanism for trying to protect these lands from outsiders. Yes, that is true. Part of the reasons communities quickly accepted, for example, the introduction of group ranches, was that they thought that going by the new land laws that were there then, if they did not claim that land, then the land would have been claimed by anybody else. So the idea was to form those group ranches to protect that land so that it's not claimed by people who are considered to be outsiders to the community. But then what actually happened is that with privatization, most of these farmers actually sold land, and the people they sold this land to kind of now interrupted or disrupted those community norms. So for example, where farmer community bought land within those pastoral communities, they immediately put up fences, and this kind of made even the pastoralists realize that they can no longer now use the land using the castro norms, and the land that is available for grazing is actually becoming small. And of course, we've had instances of conflicts again between different types of groups, for example, between farmers and pastoralists, or between pastoralists and conservationists. And the main reason behind this is that, for example, in the East African region, most of the communal lands are found in near natural reserves. So for example, during drought, if I can use the case of Kenya, the first thing that pastoralists do is to drive the animal into game reserves. Of course, they will have problems with the government and, of course, with conservationists who are trying to protect forests and national parks. Again, we also see that as a consequence of trying to, not because of land policy, but as a combined consequence of the public policies that were not favoring pastoralists, and also pastoralists trying to maintain their ways even in the face of changing environment. The value chains, for example, were not developed. So we know that, for example, again, in the case of Kenya, the beef value chain was very strong in the 70s, and currently, you know, it's a shade of what used to be there those times. And that time, farmers had a lot of challenges in getting to the markets because of, you know, poor infrastructure development. But now, even with the you know, increased infrastructure development and, you know, access to markets, the value chain is not worth, I mean, does not produce as much. And in our case, for example, Kenya still underproduces beef despite the huge potential that exists for improving beef production. So just two more comments from Oscar. So yeah, the development of land use in Nigeria is a national grazing bill to address the farmers' conflict. Maybe, yeah, Oscar, you can let us know whether this is already in force or not, or whether it's being implemented or is at a stage of being enacted so that it can be passed to allow farmers to take, you know, better management of their rangelands. So currently, the current debate is geared towards that we are at a point where we are realizing that past policies, of course, had a lot of misconceptions about pastoralism. Past policies did not favor the development, you know, of pastoralists within, or to try and help them shape their production system to be more productive, and therefore you know, get more income and improve their livelihoods. As such, what has happened is that it has created some kind of dependency for pastoralism, for pastoralists, in the sense that they've continued to be in places that have been underdeveloped, both in terms of human capital development, that is education, schools, if you think about that, both in terms of economic development, in the sense that, again, given the harsh environment that is in where most pastoral communities are found, it is very expensive to kind of invest, for example, in infrastructure like irrigation that would necessitate the change of land use. So pastoralists, the current debate right now is to kind of empower pastoral communities to be able to you know, perform pastoralist, but in a more sustainable way, so that there is no, I mean, it doesn't harm the environment, but also to make sure that it increases or maximizes the returns that, you know, these pastoralists are able to get, and they would be able to be comparable to other, for example, farmer communities, such that you know, it is actually regarded as an economic activity rather than something that they do because of, you know, because there's nothing else they can do in that place. So with that, I would like to hand it back to my colleague in Lima, Manuel. So Manuel will take us through the next session on the new directions in pastoral development.
It has been a fantastic exchange with Oscar and Kevin. Thanks a lot for that. The main question will be what happens when the institutions are not well matched to the ecological and social conditions. During this last topic in our Learning Alliance, we have introduced this paper by Wangi and Ostrom on Kenya, and they both suggest that this mismatching between institutional arrangements for land tenure and land management with ecological and social conditions is the main reason for the overuse or the kind of tragedy of the commons in these pastoralist societies in Eastern Africa. Let me recall what we have been presenting along the different topics in the Learning Alliance. We believe that what is going on both at the theoretical, conceptual, arena and in the public policy arena is a new approach towards range ecology. There are from the 1990s on, we believe that there are new directions in pastoral development, and these new directions are challenging the conventional policies on pastoralism that have been dominated by these two paradigms that Tim has just synthesized on privatization and centralization. These new directions on pastoral development produce what many researchers are labeling adaptive management. You know, as you recall, in the 1990s, Ian Schoons was one of the main leaders in introducing this notion of opportunistic management with the tracking strategies of the pastoralist communities in order to tackle both variability and heterogeneity of both grazing lands and environments or climates. That is why the notion of non-equilibrium dynamics of the ecosystems is a key notion, because the social and ecological response of the pastoralist societies have been this opportunistic management. The opportunistic management and the tracking strategies is a historical and natural response of the pastoralist societies to these challenges of viability, uncertainty, and the non-equilibrium dynamics. During our first webinar, we described a little bit in detail the different elements of the tracking strategies in terms of mobility, in terms of genetic breeding, in terms of the ability of trying to find an equilibrium between the numbers of animals and the grazing land available. And finally, the main shortcoming, the main limitation of public policies like the ones that Tim was summarizing is really how these policies overlook the non-equilibrium setting at the landscape for pastoral societies. That's why for several years now there's many authors and many research projects and many applied development projects with pastoral societies are trying to mimic the opportunism and flexibility associated with the landscape level grazing that Blanche and others have proposed several years ago. So with this framework of rethinking range ecology and having this idea of adaptive management based on these tracking strategies that have been developed for centuries within these pastoral societies, now the question is how to reach an agreement, how to reach a consensus on the most appropriate governance framework, or if you want to call it, try to make an agreement on governance of rangelands in the future. So in order to do this analysis, this assessment of governance of rangelands towards the future, let me give the room to Sandra. She will make a brief summary based upon this transparency that you have here. Please, Sandra.
Hello, everybody. What we have done here is just to put together some ideas that we think that are basic for discussion and that are just the basis to design a land policy framework for pastoralist societies. So first of all, there is a strong need, as we have seen during the Learning Alliance in general, to change the perceptions in development policy not only within the state functionaries and the state structure, but also within the development agents in general. And so, for example, in Peru, still the dominant approach that we have seen during our fieldwork or during our research is that development agents, development stakeholders, still have this dominant approach that privileges technology as a way to enhance pastoralist livelihoods. And they have this kind of deep faith that technology has a kind of inherent power to change society radically and to enhance productivity through intensification, and that this will lead to better livelihoods in the future. And they have avoided a discussion still now about the institutions that pastoralist societies themselves have developed in order to adapt to their ecosystems. And we believe that there is a key idea here related to how development policy oriented toward pastoralist societies has been based on a production concern rather on a system concern. That it's the idea of how do we maintain the system of pastoralism functioning rather than just trying to focus on how societies will produce more. So the main idea here is how are we gonna change this approach in development coming from people that such as the people that has been participating in this learning alliance that I think has a foot on research and a foot on policy. So this is not, the evidence has shown that this is not only about technical inputs. We need a major reorientation in policy that recognizes and understands first the economic value of pastoralism and also the ecological value. Tim, I'm just seeing your question. You're talking about pastoralist societies in Peru, I guess. I think this is a tricky question. We were recently in Arequipa a few months ago with Manuel and Gerardo doing a
workshop.
Doing a workshop with pastoralist leaders and also people from development. And it's interesting because I think they have a general rhetoric, like a general discourse that they have assimilated from NGOs that it's similar to NGOs, where they want fences, for example, they want fences, they want access to boreholes to have continuous running water. And there is this idea that land has been individualized, that people is doing an individual management of herds. But once you start digging deeper and trying to understand how they still manage their herds, they still do it in a communal way, in a collective way. No? So it's very interesting because I think there are various layers of how pastoralists understand their activities and how they understand their own development. There is a more superficial layer of discourse, and there is a deeper layer of discourse where they can disagree with development discourse, like the hegemonic development discourse.
Again, there is a question here or a comment by Oscar and by Eli.
Oscar, I'm seeing your comment now. I think I will address it just in a minute when I talk about customer institutions. Mm-hmm. So first I want to just make my point regarding the first idea. Because here, when we say that we need to recognize the economic and ecological value of pastoralism, I just want to develop this idea. Well, I think we know a lot about the economic value of pastoralism by now, how it has been able to adapt to low overall biomass productivity areas. that are in general ill-suited for intensive management systems, and it has developed a series of institutional arrangements, a series of productive strategies in order to adapt to these ecosystems. And it has been proven, as some papers that we've read have shown, that extensive management of rangelands through pastoralism is between 2 and 10 times more productive per unit of land than capital-intensive alternatives. I think we know a lot about that by now. I mean, this has been the main focus of research probably during the last 10 years at least. But I think we still need a lot more to do regarding valuing the ecological, the contribution from pastoralism to the conservation of natural capital. I think that there's a whole area of research that still needs to be done and still needs to be, of course, transferred. Knowledge about that still needs to be transferred to policy initiatives. So here, the main idea is what Manuel was talking about, the idea of co-evolution. How not only pastoralist societies have adapted to rangelands, but how rangelands themselves as ecosystems are totally dependent on the action of herbivores, whether they are wild herbivores or domesticated herbivores. So now what is going on in Europe, for example, and I think Pedro Herrera, that is here with us, may have some word to say about it, is that in Italy, for example, the protected areas now include, as part of their management in some of the protected areas in the Alps, they include as part of the conservation management strategies to have pastoralists staying there, try to attract them to stay, or having families of pastoralists to graze during these grasslands for a certain time, because they recognize that they contribute to the conservation of natural capital. And here the main idea is that pastoralism is not only a production system and everything that we said before, but understand that pastoralism is a tool for rangeland management and conservation of habitats. So how, the main question that, of course, we don't have full answers here, but I think our focus from people like us that have, like I said before, a foot on research and a foot on policies, how are we going to transfer all this knowledge that we have? Try to bridge the gap that still exists between research and policy design. And one important idea related to this also is, how are we going to transfer the knowledge that we are producing to pastoralist communities themselves, so they can think also about how are they going to design, design their future, or think about their future or their development, so they can develop their own strategies and talk to policy stakeholders. So based on this, and based on this basic idea of how we develop a policy approach that has a system concern rather than only a production-oriented concern, the main idea is, how are we going to guarantee, from a state point of view or development point of view, how are we going to guarantee the access of pastoralists to the diverse set of resources that they need? Yes, Oscar, I know that it's very difficult to change perceptions, but I think as we've been discussing during the Learning Alliance, this topic keeps popping up over and over again. This enormous bridge that still exists between policy and research. It's true, it's a very demanding idea, but we consider that it's like the first step that needs to be addressed. It's how are we going to change the minds and the practices of development stakeholders.
Go ahead, and then we go to the question.
Okay, so I think, coming back to the second idea of this slide is how are we going to guarantee the access of pastoralists to this diverse set of resources? And we consider that this is the first enabling condition for sustainable pastoralist societies. And here, this is a different discussion that we've also been addressing before, the difference between access and property, that actually we addressed this in the first topic of the Learning Alliance. So securing access, of course, is not the same as privatization. I think we all know that. And securing access also is not the same as formalizing land rights. A lot of research has been done, especially from the field of economics, I think, that discusses the benefits of titulation, granting, titling, sorry. And so that is a different discussion. And here I just wanted to mention quickly the brief example that we have in Peru, where one of the main strategies that rural communities in the Andes, whether they are pastoralists or agriculturalists, one of the main strategies that they have developed in order to secure their access to land has been collective property. Because actually, if you have individual property, you were more vulnerable to being expropriated, or the pressure that you felt from other agents, other actors that were trying to get into the land was felt bigger. And so collective property has been one of the main strategies to develop a secure access to land. And regarding this, now that we're talking about communities, for example, we go back again to the main point that we tried to state during the whole Learning Alliance about how are we going to think on the institutional strategies. The idea, this is the main point that we've tried to make during all this Learning Alliance, and we believe that land policy should really take this into account as the basis. How land policy will be inspired on customary institutions to develop their own strategies for development. And one of the common features that we have seen here is that most of the rangelands are managed communally. That is a tendency, whether they are informal and recognized communities or just collective regimes that include extended families, for example, as in the case of Peru. And of course, now that we're discussing about institutions, the main idea or the main structure in institutions is how do we maintain the rules and regulations regarding land management. So here we just wanted to mention some principles that we think should be taken into account. And the first one is the idea of participation. And here, what we really mean by this is when we think about land tenure, and if we, as policymakers, for example, want to develop a land tenure policy, it's not exactly as designing the perfect land tenure policy and trying to make it homogeneous for all the contexts within a country, for example. It's just the main idea is how do we create a space within local communities where they will be able to discuss and adapt the land tenure regimes, their own land tenure regimes, their own land tenure rules for their own contexts, because this is one of the main characteristics within pastoralist institutions, is that they are able to be flexible, and they are flexible because they have to adapt to the characteristics of their environment that are highly variable, highly heterogeneous, and highly uncertain. So rather than trying to design a legal framework, for example, that states which is the perfect land tenure regime, we need to develop the spaces within the local context so people themselves can discuss how the land tenure regimes will be adapted to whether it's to time or whether it's to this space. The other idea that we put here, the other principle, it's the idea of
multiple scales.
Yes, we said transactionality, but I think it's not the correct word. What we mean is, how are we going to work within different scales, going from the local to the national to the local, subnational, national, and even regional levels. And of course, the local should be still the main focus of land policy because of what we've just been discussing all over. But here, for example, the initiative that Pedro Herrera showed us during the last topic regarding this Spanish platform that is trying to raise awareness in the whole European Union.
No, there is a question by Eli on Zambia, and Pedro has made a comment. They are reviewing the land policy in Zambia.
The process. How can I contribute to this?
And then Pedro make a comment to this, I think.
Eli, your question, I think we can address it at the end because it's a more general discussion about land policy in general. I think Manuel, Tim, and I, we can address your question later. And I'm just gonna comment the comment that Pedro has just made. Yes, that is exactly the point, Pedro. And we in South America, this idea of co-evolution between environments and the social systems that are producing within these environments, it's still so far from also not only from policy but also from research. That's why we are saying, and we were discussing with Manuel during these last weeks, that so much still needs to be done to understand the contribution of pastoralism to the maintenance of natural capital. And of course, still many conservation policies are banning not only the use of, from pastoralists, they are still not only banning pastoralists to use land, but also other indigenous communities. There's a whole dimension that still needs to be worked regarding conservation initiatives. Can I continue?
Yes, and try to finish because time is...
Okay, so besides this idea, this principle that we were saying about how to work through different scales, was the idea that it's so important because we have seen this when we were discussing the evolution of land tenure within our own case study. And it's the idea of conflict mediation and resolution. So one of the main things that we have seen that have led to the crisis of collective institutions, of collective institutional arrangements in our own case study has been this failure to address the conflict mediation and resolution. So in our own particular case, at least, that we've been discussing in the previous topics, the loss of the authorities, the loss of the source of authority, that in the case of Arequipa in a region was the main elder, the loss of the authority of the elder that regulated the condominiums has been one of the main causes of the institutional crisis of collective management. And when somebody during the last topic mentioned GADA, that it's this traditional form of authority that regulates the access, that allocates the access to resources to members, this institution sounded a lot like the institution that we have in Peru here. And here I just wanted to leave a question open to discuss, is that can we create from external mechanisms that somehow fill the gap that is being left by the crisis of collective institutions. I mean, can we create from municipalities, for example, some kind of mechanism that can fulfill this function that is being avoided or left behind by the crisis of collective institutions? And finally, of course, the fourth idea that we wanted to leave for participants is that development, land tenure, land policy should have this in mind. How are we going to ensure that pastoralists continue with their strategies of opportunistic management of resources and having mobility at the center of this? I think that's it.
Thank you, Sandra. I understand that there are other questions. One has been raised by Oscar regarding the need to assist pastoralists in order to diversify income sources, to reduce risk and develop supplementary income. That is a very complex issue, because usually public policies use this argument in order to promote these paradigms of privatization and sanitarization, and trying to switch pastoralists towards agricultural activities and even non-agricultural urban activities. So once again, what we have been arguing is that having these non-equilibrium dynamics in the ecosystems, trying to impose a change of economic activity at the end is a blunder, is a policy mistake, is a policy failure. There are other questions. And before going to the closing of this webinar, I will give the floor to Tim. There is a question by Pedro and others. Tim requested me to have a comment on this. Please go ahead, Tim, to make your feedback.
For your contributions. I think, first of all, I would like to just highlight something that Pedro had mentioned. And I think, yeah, thank you, Pedro, for bringing this up. So in one of the literature that we reviewed by Facting and Mans, they compared Mongolia and Kenya. And the reason they did this was because both countries had implemented privatization policies in community lands, and Kenya was seen to be, a case of failure, while Mongolia was seen to be a case of success. But as Pedro mentioned, is that even when, despite the success, for example, that Mongolia enjoyed, they are now probably rethinking about that tenure, to bring it back under community land. And in my view, one of the reasons, of course, is that the pastoralist ecosystem is very complex, and there is need to understand how they've been managing to do this, because other than resources, there are also issues to do with shocks and how they're able to deal with these shocks. So once land has been privatized, of course, every economic agent will seek to maximize and make, great profit from that. But I think the idea is how can we understand this complexity to kind of come up with recommendations that are suitable and flexible to deal with certain issues. So one of the things that, again, Pedro had mentioned was that if you look at even the conflicts we have within the different laws, for example, even if I use the case of Kenya, you will find that pastoralist communities exist next to protected places, which are either natural reserves, forest, or game parks. But before these laws came into place, these pastoralists coexisted with the wildlife, for example, peacefully, and we never used to have kind of the conflicts that are there. But the challenge is, even when we have severe drought, if pastoralists try to drive their animals into the game parks or into the forest or natural reserves, they'll be arrested, even though there is pasture there. So one of the things that, for us, we kind of food for thought for us is that, can we have a scenario whereby pastoralists can be given like seasonal rights, because they pose no threats to the wildlife, because they have been coexisting together, since time immemorial. already we have cases where this is happening, but again, not outside the state mechanisms. We have an NGO that kind of collated a number of communities together, and they started, their own private conservancies, actually maintained by the communities. And so maybe to touch on what Oscar is saying, it's a form of diversification because communities are now able to get extra income from tourism, and they're actually the ones who are managing the game parks rather than giving it back to the government. And in this particular case, since they own the land, they're able to kind of access that land during drought periods or extreme farming. So that kind of thing is a very good example that kind of gives us hope that there indeed can be some kind of middle ground where both pastoralists can benefit and conservationists can also be happy. Then another issue that Eli had mentioned in the case of Zambia, we are also at a place where in Kenya the community land laws are being reviewed. So again, trying to answer this with what Oscar had mentioned earlier, I think coming from where we've learned from the time we started this research, so two key things emerge is that one, the failure of the policies were mainly because they were top down. They were imposed on communities. So as Sandra had mentioned, as researchers, we have a very great opportunity to provide this information and empower communities so that communities can be able to demand for certain changes, whether it's within the laws or within their productive systems. So empowering communities with this kind of information will give pressure from below that will force policymakers to respond to them. The other thing is that by strengthening the community's management structures and institutions goes a long way towards sustaining these community systems. So in this case, what we are trying to do in Kenya, we realized that previously customary laws and norms were never recognized in law, such that you can the only thing that maybe you could happen to you is the social opprobrium if you're a member of the community. But then if you're not a member of the community, you don't care about that. So what we've been trying to push for in the new law is that the new community land law recognizes the customary laws for the different communities, so that even if you are there, you have to abide by those laws. And even the communities can actually now kind of take action on you by either taking you to court and kind of getting redress in the case that you violate some of the customary laws, which in our case we saw that it was one of the key drivers to changes in the land regimes in the communal systems. So I think, Manuel, we can take back the floor. I just wanted to briefly share that. Thank you.
And thank you to all the participants and for your questions and active participation. There are a couple of comments that we would like to make before finishing this webinar. Regarding this issue of how to contribute to land policy debates, like for example in Zambia, in the case of Eli, I think that there are at least 2 or 3 general policy issues that can be put on in front. One is the land use planning tools that are put in place in order to clearly identify the rangelands. So in order to minimize the potential policy failure that means to change land use in these non-equilibrium dynamics that we have been describing, it is important to have land use policy tools in place. So before doing any change in land policies, it is important to have at least some preliminary tools for land use planning, for land zoning, in order to identify the rangelands. A second issue is I mean, having in place or not the prior informed consent policies following the ILO Convention 169, it is important to put in place these participatory mechanisms and these consultation mechanisms for indigenous communities or ethnic groups. So I would strongly recommend that to have these like a precondition for any policy change in regarding land policies that tackles tribal and ethnic lands, no, and communal lands. And finally, regarding the question of Oscar in terms of income diversification, as well as the dialogue between Pedro and Oscar regarding the state ownership, a couple of remarks. One is that we are not discussing the whole array of economic activities that these pastoralist households may have. We are discussing only the land, the grazing land management. Indeed, that is a very diverse map of pastoralist societies, and there are some pastoralist societies that will require for sure an economic diversification strategy. I see that Oscar has made another comment here regarding this. Maybe yes, he says that he doesn't support diversification that pushes pastoralists out of their traditional occupation, but diversification from animal production activities of pastoralists. Also, other resources that may be found in pastoral environment should not be left abandoned. Of course, we totally agree with that, Oscar. And Eli is making another remark regarding land use. Perfect. So that's basically what we wanted to argue. And as Pedro was trying to say also, that the state ownership is not, quote unquote, a bad thing in principle, but it is important to have some like checks and balances in order to promote a policy dialogue when these land policy changes are happening or are being pushed by different stakeholders at the state level. So, with all this in mind, basically, this is the main question that we would like to leave for everybody. You know, which are the challenges the land policy on pastoral societies will face in the future. We have been discussing this throughout this webinar. And if you don't have any other question or comment, in the name of Tejemeo Institute, in the name of Grade and the whole ELA team, it has been a pleasure to have you in this second webinar. And please go ahead and get engaged and get involved in the last days of our sixth topic. And try. We are going to do our best effort to produce a final summary and synthesis for your discussion in your countries. Thanks a lot to everybody, and see you in our Learning Alliance environment. Till next time, ciao.